Our next speaker is Emily Ekins. She is the Director of Polling for the Reason Foundation, where she leads the Reason Rupee Public Opinion Research Project. Emily's professional experience includes quantitative analysis of the Tea Party movement for Cato, and her research focuses primarily on American politics, including public opinion, the Tea Party movement, survey methodology, and political economy. And I'd like to welcome Emily to our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. So I'm the polling director at Reason Foundation and Reason Magazine, and I run the Reason Root poll. It's a national quarterly poll. We poll Americans nationwide on a series of policy issues, values, politics, who you're going to vote for, all of those kind of typical polling type questions. But in addition to that, we really try to get at substantive policy issues and understand how Americans make trade-offs. So today I'm going to show you some of the data from one of our recent polls on transportation policy. I think I left that right there. Okay. Let's see, how are we going? There we go. It's not coordinated on my computer here. Okay, why does polling, but first I think we should take a step back and talk about why does polling matter. Sometimes I meet with a bit of resistance about why do we care what polls tell us. I've noticed sometimes people don't like polls because they don't like the results. But that's not the reason, that's not quite sufficient for us to dismiss them altogether, and I'm going to explain why today. Polling is not just so we have a cute headline to put at the top of a newspaper headline. It's also to understand our audience. We need to understand where people are coming from if we're going to effectively communicate with them. We need to understand what their underlying assumptions are. It's true that most people are not that ideological. They don't think about policies the way we're thinking about them. But most people have gut reactions. When they hear about a new policy idea, a high-speed rail train in their area, they have a gut reaction to that. It's usually, do you want a free high-speed rail train? The answer is yes. Do you want to pay for the high-speed rail train? The answer is usually no. Understanding how people make trade-offs is important. Exactly, using trade-offs is important. And from this, it can help us tell a narrative. You can look at a series of polling data points, and it can begin to tell a story about where the electorate currently is. And so like what Randall was saying, perhaps talking about the budget deficit isn't going to move the dial for certain people. Find out what does move the dial. Perhaps for them what they're really interested in is what's going to help urban residents, low-income urban residents get to work. We'll show them how your policies are going to make that more likely to happen instead of just talking about the deficit. And from this, from creating the narrative, from real data, you can demonstrate to lawmakers what the public thinks about your policy proposals. And so every poll that's out there that tells us one thing about the electorate, there's probably another poll that tells us something else. But you can still parse through that and kind of get a general idea about what people think about your policy proposals. I wanted to go through just a few basics in case you're interested in running your own polls. What's very important is in all polls to avoid biased or leading language. Sometimes we have an urge to give people all this information from our point of view and then see how they respond. But this isn't going to tell us anything accurate about how the real world works, because in the real world, very different opinions are going to go out there, and people are going to put their best foot forward. And so when we poll, we want to think about what our opponent's view is on the policy and accurately represent that view, so that when we compare how people think about the various proposals, we have an accurate view of what they think, if they were to hear it on TV, for instance, or in the news. Use a reputable pollster, and please use cell phones in your samples. If you don't, you're going to underrepresent younger people, Latinos, and if you're doing maybe a Republican primary in a small area, perhaps landlines would be sufficient, but cell phone usage is very important in your polls. Another thing, it's important to ask baseline calibration questions. Find out what everyone else is asking and make sure you ask it like that at first. And then you can follow up on those questions and give people information and see how they respond. If you don't do this, you might be accused of running a push-pull. This happened to a group in Florida. So this is one way to avoid that. And then be as transparent as possible with your data and with the results, so people know that you really are interested in what people genuinely think and you're just giving them the honest truth. I wanted to give, before I get into some of the specific data on our transportation polling results, I wanted to talk about making an impact at the national level. So sometimes what's going on in your local and state issues, you wonder, could this have a national implication? Well, we surveyed Wisconsin residents back in 2000, what was the recall? 11? When Governor Scott Walker tried to reform public employee unions' collective bargaining. We entered that state with a poll, and you might remember that lots of polls were talking about whether or not people favored or opposed limiting collective bargaining of public sector unions, or just labor unions in general. But there's one thing that they would always do. They'd always say, do you favor or oppose taking away public employee rights? Are you in favor of taking away rights? Most people don't know what collective bargaining is, so what they really heard was, do you want to take away rights from people? And each poll kept around 60% no, oppose, oppose, oppose. So we went in there, and what we did is this is an example of a message test. We split the sample in two. One half the sample, we asked this question: if they would favor or oppose limiting collective bargaining rights for public sector unions. The other half of the sample, so this is two separate parts of the sample, got this question: limiting collective bargaining for public employee unions. The word rights was not included in the second question. Look at the results. So when people were asked about limiting the rights of public employee unions, a majority opposed. And when they were just asked about limiting collective bargaining without the word rights involved, a majority favored. State level issues can have a national impact. This was our press release from our Wisconsin poll. The press release went straight into the Wall Street Journal, word for word, because it had a national impact, it had a national implication, because what was happening in Wisconsin, it was clear at the national level why governors reforming public employee unions in one state could affect other states. So now on to transportation. From this data, I think you'll be able to see a narrative emerge, and I'm going to walk you through it. This comes from a national telephone poll. So this is, again, each local and state each local area and state is going to have their own perspective on various transportation issues. So keep in mind, this is a national sample. But the national level, most Americans are dissatisfied with the overall quality of the transportation system. Okay. Not only that, most Americans think over the past 5 years traffic congestion's been getting worse, and that over the next 5 years is going to continue to get worse. So these are the underlying assumptions about where people are when you first talk to them. Looking at this a little deeper, about 36% said that it has been getting worse and it's going to continue to get worse in the future. Who are these people? Data can tell us this. These are primarily women, 45 to 64, college graduates, but interestingly enough, they're nonpartisan. This isn't a Democratic thing. This isn't a Republican thing. This is straight up nonpartisan. Okay. Let me back up for a second. So what I've showed you thus far is that people are dissatisfied with the transportation system's quality and are concerned about congestion. So perhaps What people want is mass transit. If only we had more light rail trains, commuter rails, bus lines, this would solve our problem. The numbers kind of cut off there at the bottom, but about 2/3 of Americans would disagree. They would prefer that we prioritize spending not for mass transit, but for roads and highways. And if you look at the group that does want mass transit, who are they? Democratic, liberal, postgraduates, non-white, and often uses public transit. So it's kind of a coalition, but it's important to understand why, what the demographics are of the various groups that agree or disagree and why they feel that way. Not only does a majority of Americans favor prioritizing highway spending, all partisan groups, a majority of partisan groups, favor prioritizing highway spending over mass transit. Now, you'll see that the Democratic group is a very slim majority, but still technically there. You'll see that if you look into the data, that preferences for mass transit declines with age. And, okay. So what does this tell us? So most people are concerned about the transportation system, but they don't want to prioritize funding for mass transit. So what do they want? Maybe what they want is to raise gas taxes to expand their roads and highways. No. 77% oppose raising the gas tax, even when we tell them that nearly all the revenue is used to pay for highways and transit, because maybe they thought that it was going to be used for like the general fund. No, even when they know that, they oppose. So why is that? Why would people oppose? Well, one reason is 65% expect that the money will be spent ineffectively. Okay, so what do they want? We realize, we know the electorate sees that there's a problem, they prioritize roads, and they don't want to raise taxes. Not really surprising, I guess, at this point. What do they want? Well, maybe they would be open to toll roads. 58% say that if we're going to be expanding roads and highways, they would rather use it with tolls rather than with tax increases. And this is true for each partisan group, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And not only that, a similar share say that if a toll road was in their area, that they would actually use it. Now again, just because you say something in a survey doesn't mean that your behavior will reflect that, but this is a good first step in understanding how people feel about toll roads. We also asked people about if they lived near a toll road. Interestingly, look at this, 68% of people who live near a toll road would prefer to expand highways and roads with more toll roads, which means that if you have experience with toll roads, you tend to have a positive experience. Now, if maybe this were flipped, we might think, oh, people that use toll roads haven't really liked them, but instead this actually suggests that people who have the most experience with toll roads like them. But before we get too far, might there be another reason that people that live near toll roads like toll roads? They're slightly higher income, slightly higher education, which tends to correlate with preference for toll roads. However, if you look at the data, and again, you'd only know this if you did a poll, if you look at the polling data, it's not that big of a difference. And there's actually no partisan differences, there's no gender differences, no race or ethnicity differences between these two. So I think you have pretty good evidence to say that people who have experience with tolls tend to like them. As we might expect, a preference for toll roads does increase with income, but you'll notice that even the lowest income group, a majority, do prefer toll roads, as well as different education groups. Look at that. Even post-grads, 66% favor, and typically post-grads like mass transit, so this is interesting. Okay, the next question though is how much are you going to pay? Again, just because people answer a question this way doesn't mean that's what their behavior will actually show, but it's a good first step. People who don't live near toll roads, as you can see, the distribution is they tend to want to pay less. They're not really familiar with toll roads. They don't really know what they should expect to pay. People that live near toll roads, they have a more even distribution, anywhere from they don't want to pay anything up to about $2, which is a little bit below where it would probably need to be for most toll roads. But here we can look at the national average. On average, about 75 cents for a toll road is the median response, with the average response, the mean response being $1.34. Kind of gives you an idea of where people stand. So that means if the toll roads you're proposing cost more than this, you have to explain something. Why is it more? And how often would you be using it? And how much time would you save? Not only do Americans favor more toll roads in order to expand highways, they favor opening up HOV lanes to drivers who pay a toll. Why not? And not only that, majorities of each partisan group favor this proposal, including a majority of Democrats and independents. Of course, Republicans are the most favorable to this. But what Americans don't favor, according to this poll at least, were adjustable rate tolls, which means that at high traffic times of the day, the toll would go up, and at low traffic times of the day, low congestion, then the tolls would go down. Overwhelmingly, people tend to oppose this. And you'll see that there is a slight correlation with income, but less so than with just regular polls. And less of a correlation with education as well, which means that you're not getting that higher income group, the middle class, or the college grads on board with this kind of a proposal. Future research would want to figure out why that is. But you can probably get an idea of that uncertainty probably bothers people a lot, not knowing what to expect, if it's going to be changing during the day. So again, another poll could help us understand why people feel that way. But, on the bright side, a majority of Americans favor public-private partnerships in order to build and expand roads and highways. And this increases quite a bit with income. This is correlated with income. And also education. Perhaps people who have higher levels of education have a greater understanding that public-private partnerships aren't necessarily a bad thing. There seemed to be more concern about private companies running government services at lower levels of education. And also, you've got majorities of Democrats and Republicans in favor of public-private partnerships. Independents, you see a plurality support, or a little under 50. And part of that is because a lot of them said, I don't know. Well, what is a public-private partnership? Which means if this is something that you're advocating for, you'd have to explain what it is and what the pros and cons are. So in sum, I think that I've told a story with this data. The story tells us that the baseline underlying assumptions is that the gut reaction of most Americans would be, yeah, the transportation system isn't excellent. It's not horrible, but it's not excellent. And yes, there are traffic congestion problems. But the solution is not raising the gas tax, because when government raises taxes, it tends to waste that money. And that's consistent throughout most surveys. But what they are willing to do is allow people who are going to be benefiting from those expanded roads to pay for those roads. Let them pay for it. And they're open to new innovations and public-private partnerships to be able to bring the cost down and get new services that they wouldn't get. This is the story that this data tells us, and this is something that wouldn't be possible without polling data. So I think I will wrap it up there.